Imagine waking up one morning to discover that every dollar in your bank account has vanished. Not stolen, not frozen, simply gone. Now multiply that feeling by entire nations. Because that is exactly what happened to the gold reserves of dozens of countries during the most devastating conflicts in human history. Billions in precious metal accumulated over generations disappeared overnight. Some was stolen, some was hidden, and some simply evaporated into the chaos of war. But here is what no one talks about. Much of it is still missing today. When most people think about the economics of war, they picture factories churning out weapons or governments printing money to fund their armies. But the real story lies in something far more tangible and far more valuable: gold. The ultimate store of wealth, the foundation of monetary systems, the one asset that has held value across every civilization and every century. And during wartime, it becomes the most coveted prize of all. The disappearance of wartime gold reserves is not just a footnote in military history. It is one of the greatest financial mysteries of the modern era. Entire national treasuries vanished without a trace, leaving behind only empty vaults and unanswered questions. Some of these reserves were worth more than the annual budgets of entire countries. And the ripple effects of their disappearance shaped the post-war world in ways that most people never realized. But this is not just about ancient history. The patterns that emerged during these conflicts, the methods used to hide and move vast wealth, the networks that profited from chaos, they did not disappear when the wars ended. They evolved, they adapted, and they are still operating today in ways that would shock you. Let me start with a number that will make your head spin. During the Second World War alone, an estimated 4,000 tons of gold went missing from occupied territories. To put that in perspective, that is more gold than most countries hold in their entire national reserves today. At current prices, we are talking about over $250 billion worth of precious metal that simply vanished into thin air. The story begins in the 1930s as tensions across Europe reached a boiling point. Central banks and governments, sensing the coming storm, began moving their gold reserves to what they thought were safer locations. The Bank of France shipped gold to the United States. The British moved theirs to Canada. Smaller nations like Belgium and the Netherlands tried to hide their reserves in secret locations within their own borders. But they had no idea what they were up against. When the German war machine began its march across Europe, they brought with them something unprecedented in military history. Specialized units whose sole purpose was to locate and seize gold reserves, artwork, and other valuable assets. These were not random soldiers looking for quick loot. These were organized, systematic operations run by economists, bankers, and financial experts who understood exactly what they were hunting for and where to find it. The speed at which these operations moved was breathtaking. When Belgium fell in 1940, German units reached the National Bank of Belgium within hours of the invasion. They found the main vaults empty, but they did not stop there. Using captured bank records and interrogating officials, they tracked down secret storage facilities across the country. Within weeks, they had located and seized over 200 tons of Belgian gold that had been carefully hidden in locations the government thought were impenetrable. But here is where the story takes a dark turn. Much of this gold was not simply added to German reserves or used to fund the war effort. Instead, it disappeared into a shadow network of private banks, shell companies, and numbered accounts that stretched across neutral countries. Switzerland, Sweden, Spain, Portugal, and even some institutions in South America became the endpoints for gold that had been systematically looted from occupied nations. The Swiss banks alone received over 1,600 tons of gold during the war years. Officially, this was payment for goods and services provided to Germany. Unofficially, much of it was stolen treasure that had been laundered through a complex web of transactions designed to obscure its origin. Bank officials asked few questions as long as the proper paperwork was presented. And there was always proper paperwork, forged or otherwise. What makes this even more sinister is that many of these institutions knew exactly what they were handling. Internal documents discovered decades later reveal that bank executives regularly discussed the suspicious nature of the gold flowing through their vaults. They knew it was likely stolen. They knew it belonged to occupied nations and persecuted populations. But the profits were too enormous to ignore, and the profits were staggering. Banks charged fees for storage, for transfers, for currency exchanges, and for providing the secrecy that made the entire operation possible. They were not just passive recipients of stolen gold. They were active participants in the largest theft in human history. The scale of this operation becomes clear when you realize that it was not limited to Europe. As the war spread across the Pacific, similar operations emerged in every theater of conflict. When Japanese forces swept through Southeast Asia, they carried with them detailed intelligence on gold reserves held by colonial governments, private banks, and wealthy families who had accumulated fortunes from decades of trade. The Bank of Java, the Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation, the reserves of the Dutch East Indies all became targets in a systematic campaign of financial warfare. But unlike the European theatre, where much of the stolen gold found its way into established banking networks, the Pacific operations often resulted in something far more mysterious. Entire shipments of gold simply vanished. Ships carrying tons of precious metal would leave occupied ports and never reach their intended destinations. Convoys would disappear into the jungles of Burma or the islands of the Philippines, leaving behind only rumours and conflicting reports. The Japanese military developed an intricate system for moving looted wealth. Gold would be melted down and recast into unmarked bars, then shipped to secret facilities across the occupied territories. Some was buried in elaborate underground complexes, some was hidden in natural caves that had been expanded and fortified, and some was loaded onto submarines that would transport it to locations that remain unknown to this day. One of the most documented cases involves what became known as the Yamashita Treasure, named after General Tomoyuki Yamashita, who commanded Japanese forces in the Philippines. As Allied forces closed in during the final months of the war, massive quantities of gold, jewelry, and artifacts that had been looted from across Southeast Asia were allegedly buried in complex tunnel systems throughout the Philippine Islands. The scale of these operations was mind-boggling. Thousands of prisoners of war and local labourers were forced to dig elaborate underground networks, only to be executed afterwards to maintain secrecy. But here is what makes this story so haunting. When the war ended and investigators began trying to track down the missing gold, they discovered that the disappearances were not random acts of wartime chaos. They were part of carefully planned operations that had been years in the making. Intelligence networks had been mapping financial systems, identifying key personnel, and preparing detailed plans for seizing assets long before the first shots were fired. The aftermath was even more disturbing. As Allied forces liberated occupied territories, they found empty vaults, destroyed records, and witnesses who had been systematically eliminated. Bank officials who might have provided crucial information about where gold had been moved were often among the first casualties of occupation. Documents that could have revealed the location of hidden reserves had been deliberately destroyed. And many of the German and Japanese officers who possessed knowledge of these operations either died in the final battles or disappeared into the chaos of defeat. This was not accidental. It was a deliberate strategy to ensure that even if the war was lost, the financial spoils would remain beyond the reach of the victorious Allies. And it worked. Decades of investigation by governments, intelligence agencies, and private researchers have recovered only a fraction of what went missing during those years. In the end, billions in gold reserves vanished during wartime, but the networks that orchestrated these disappearances never truly disbanded. They adapted, evolved, and continue operating in the shadows of global finance today. The missing gold is more than a historical mystery. It is a reminder that in times of crisis, wealth does not simply disappear. It transfers from those who trust the system to those who understand its vulnerabilities. History has the answers. I'll show you where to look.